Hello,
Hello,
I'm Alex,
and I'm Val.
and we're here to talk about the second episode of Season 6B of The Sopranos, Stage 5.
I wish it was easier to say, like, I wish they just had kept the numbers going, like 6, 13, 6, 14.
Right, but they didn't.
They didn't.
It's too bad.
I don't know. It's challenging.
Right.
But we are here to talk about it anyways.
We are
And
here
it's
to
an
talk
amazing
about
episode.
It is. Yeah.
And you said all the episodes in 6B are amazing.
It's
and
true.
So I forgot that they were all this amazing. I remembered that they were all, or maybe they're not all this amazing. I particularly have always liked this episode. But wow, I forgot how amazing it is.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I think that they're dealing with a lot of the overarching themes of the entire series. I think we're really confronted with death in this episode, amongst other questions. For me, the question of control really comes up.
What it actually looks like to be boss. Like it's an insight into Tony's psyche also.
Absolutely.
Well, and lots of characters' psyche about being boss and what that means for them.
Also, maybe like interpretation or reading things on a deeper level. There's this kind of question of getting things at its most basic level, of just kind of experiencing entertainment, or maybe reading underneath.
Well, it's like meta, this show. Like it's like meta
Absolutely.
writers and production and like viewers, right? Like we deal with it watching this show all the time. So
Right.
it's kind of like a haha at viewers, because it's like, stop trying to like look at these characters reading into these things and look at what it's doing to them. And then we have the one character saying about, leotards and tutus that it what is he? I want to get
Leotards
the
are for modern,
Yeah.
and tutus are for ballet.
and it doesn't make a difference, right? So I think that's the thing that's kind of like overarching in this episode for me, and among other things, but like it doesn't make a difference. These things that we're like overanalyzing, like it, and these characters who are trying to, I don't know, I think he's just like fucking with us.
Right.
Like we go all the time about, colors and
Right.
stuff like that, and we
Sure
we
do.
acknowledge how it's like, well, sometimes this symbol means this and sometimes this symbol means that, and like it's in flux and it's flexible, and so like in reality,
Totally.
like it doesn't make a difference. As that little boy who we'll never see again, Phil Leotardo's great nephew, that guy,
right.
I'm sure we'll see him again. But he's the one who kind of, I think, hammers home a big part of this episode and this show is it doesn't make a difference.
Wait, his nephew? The one about leotards and tutus?
Yeah.
Wasn't that a girl?
Well, she was saying that, but then the other little guy, the other little nephew, was
I
the one who
understand.
was like, it doesn't make a difference.
There is something about that too, just in terms of interpreting symbols and reading beneath the surface. Actually, like I found it was interesting, even like right after John dies and he wants a cigarette, which I'll get into later.
Yeah.
They actually cut to this shot of just a white ball.
I know.
Right after he dies. And
Yeah.
there was that talk about the Robert Louis Stevenson poem in Meadow much earlier saying like, oh, death is black, but it's also white.
Yeah.
And we've been seeing things in black and white terms. We've seen black and white used as symbols, and we've seen it equated with death. And in this instance, they actually choose white, which is probably the one that's used not at all or much less.
Yeah.
They actually kind of like flip things on us.
Yep.
It's kind of both. I think that's the point. And there's actually almost this like kind of like quantum aspect where they're talking about like Schrodinger's.
Quantum.
But it is like they
Yeah.
talk about Schrodinger's cat
Yep.
at a point in this show.
Last season, yeah.
Yeah, and
in
there's and then there's this idea of maybe some of these things being both and not being able to peg things down to black and white. So there's almost like this other level of these characters interpreting things in black and white terms, maybe showing them in ways that could be interpreted that way, but is actually broader than that.
Yeah,
It's
you're
really
You're so right. I think
really
that
interesting.
that does a better
Quantum
job of
Sopranos.
saying Quantum Sopranos. No, that does a better job of saying what I was trying to say than I could do. Yeah, I think it's
Thanks.
huge. No, it's true. I think it's just a huge comment on the show itself. But then again, like you said, like also on these characters. I think we have a lot of moments like that in this episode that are really kind of like giving us a greater insight into the show.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much in this episode, it's hard to know where to begin. But I think we can start at the beginning because I think that leads us to some of these themes.
Okay.
They start with the Cleaver movie.
Which is just so good.
The movie is so good. You love the movie.
I actually, no, but here's, like, you know me. So, like, whenever I see a movie that's, like, campy / bad,
right,
I'm always like, that's how they intended it to feel. Like, they want it to feel this way.
Right.
I think this film...
Right, like you think The Room is a brilliant creation.
I do think The Room is a brilliant creation. Exactly. But I think this is kind of like that. I think this is like... it's like a genre of its own. I think it's incredible. And I also love like I don't actually know a lot of film terms, but when at the end it goes from the cleaver in the head and it pans slowly to the windshield of the car and then focuses
the
in on
and the propane
on the two objects hanging on the dash. It's so dramatic.
That's the thing. I mean, like that's really what it's about. Sacred and propane things.
I know. Always. I mean, never
Little
forget.
Carmine nailed it.
Little Carmine. I remember to talk about Little Carmine. I hope we get to him because there was a lot about him in this episode, but there was also like a lot of other stuff too. But yeah, we have a lesser Baldwin as our opening character. I think Danny. Is it Danny Baldwin actually?
Seems to be Daniel Baldwin.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I love how, I mean, we've obviously seen this show before, but I love how if you're a watcher of this show, you could think for a little while that this is actually what's happening in the show. Yeah. And we get that with dreams in this show also. We get that with a lot of things. And I just love that so much. Yeah. It's just like we were also talking about how we might not watch Sopranos after this for a long time. But I do like to think back to always the first time I watched it. Because some of these things that are no longer surprises to us who've seen it for many times. Right. You forget how amazing they are and how surprising they were. Right. And there's, again, a lot in this episode that's like that. Yeah. Absolutely. We'll talk about it, but like, the reveal that Meadow and Finn broke up, right? Like, there's just so many of these things that if I can't meet a
normal guy, I don't intend to discuss Finn, and we don't discuss Finn. Yeah, that's it. I
know. They're just so masterful at these like little surprises and little reveals. Maybe that wouldn't maybe surprise is not the right term for the Meadow and Finn thing, but it's just the way that they unveil information to you is always so unique. Right. And I am skipping ahead a little bit here, but I know I'll get to it. But remind me when we're talking about their choice to show us which they've done before, a clip of a video of another show on TV, like the interview show. Right. Anyways, I love the choices that they make in this episode. Yeah. I just wanted to say that.
No, absolutely. First. Yeah. I just think, I mean, there is a lot of this kind of meta aspect to this episode. More
when they're
so
dissecting,
than we've ever seen before.
Putting in the extra scene or not, in their producers meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly too, these mobsters who have been drawn to the Hollywood medium for these reasons of violence and kind of easy satisfaction, thinking that it would also maybe be easy on the other side, saying it's a little boring, actually, to be honest, behind the scenes. And Christopher saying that Tony doesn't give a shit about production.
Yeah. It's like this other life that we see, we've been gone for a bit, I guess, and all of a sudden these characters, we don't see a lot of these guys last episode. Right. Right? But suddenly these characters kind of have a different life. And maybe there is a time jump between Sopranos home movies and now. Right. And that I was trying to kind of deduce, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was late summer when we left Sopranos home movies. Could it be later on in the year? Right. Probably. So we may have had some kind of time jump too. Right. But yeah. There's just there's just a lot going on even surrounding the movie itself, and then the way it infiltrates the narrative of this episode. Yes. People interpreting the movie. And there is this kind of these multiple levels to interpret everything. So even the way the show starts, it's interesting because it seems like it could be an episode of Sopranos. This could be action that's happening for the characters until we see that it's Daniel Baldwin that
kind of puts things off. Yet it could be Daniel Baldwin
could be Daniel
acting.
Baldwin,
It's the
totally.
same thing as
yeah.
later on we have Christopher McDonald.
Yeah.
And at first I think it's him acting as himself, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's somebody supporting Christopher. So they really are playing with us in this episode.
Yeah.
And what is what. So they're starting to kind of break down the wall a lot more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we also see, like, we see Danny Baldwin as Danny Baldwin in this
Right.
episode also. We see him play this character. We also see him as himself.
Right.
It's confusing.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we see also, like, in the first scene, it kind of unfolds and becomes more and more obviously not The Sopranos. But there is this kind of like cheap violence, this sensationalistic approach to violence that could never fit on The Sopranos, because violence always kind of serves a greater purpose in this show.
But it
underscores who the characters are, how they develop, and it's gratuitous. In fact, in the production room, they're even talking about gratuitously adding another scene just for violence. But it's a take on the mob genre kind of on the whole to have this violent aspect of it portrayed on the big screen for people, because The Sopranos is so not that.
But I'm sure, like, they did have a lot of viewers who were, like, wanting more from them, right?
Right.
And so I'm sure
And
they
I think
did
it's commentary
have...
on that.
Yeah, I'm sure they did have discussions like that about, like, what to include and what not to.
Right.
They would have had to have. I mean, I think these writers are pretty, like, strong. I don't think they're, like, easily swayed by, what the commercial market wants or anything like that. But I'm sure they had these discussions.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know.
And yet, I think that the artistic integrity of the people behind the show was always kind of the highest, I think.
Well, that's what I'm kind of saying. Like,
Right.
I trust them more than I trust other writers not to
absolutely.
do that. But
Everything is
I'm
intentional.
sure that it would have come up.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. It's great that when these things do show up, it's kind of deeper than it appears to be. There's almost a secondary purpose for those scenes to even exist there. It's really interesting. And then also interestingly, like the way that the movie is kind of portrayed in terms of the different people working on it. JT and this director Morgan Yam has the microphone taken away from him. JT's never mentioned. The people who actually did kind of structure this movie and put it together and actually had some technique and movie making get no credit, and it's all about the people who financed it.
Right.
And were coming from the mob side, who actually had very little to do with the actual production.
Totally. Although it's interesting, like, that we do find out for sure that, like, Chris actually did write it, right? Like, that...
Well, did he?
Well, I think so. Otherwise, why would he be so scared about that with Tony?
Well, it's clearly his idea. The story is clearly his.
Right.
Right. I mean, I think any of those kind of crafts were completely delegated to others. And I think JT really did write it.
Okay.
But the idea was given to him.
Right.
The entire structure of the story was given to him, and that's kind of the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, and then it's kind of hilarious, like these cheap additions to it to kind of throw somebody off of his set or something.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, and that Tony catches that, right?
But
Like,
it's interesting because Tony doesn't really catch things at first. Like he is.
No, at first he's flattered.
He's flattered, and he's also swayed by these little details, like like she's Asian, or in Christopher's words, she's Oriental.
Right, that was appropriate. Yeah.
But that's something that's really interesting in this episode is Rosalie and Carmela are reading underneath the surface. I mean, it's not a very profound analysis, deconstruction, if you will, of Cleaver.
Yeah.
It's quite
Well,
obvious.
do you think that Rosalie even actually has the same interpretation as Carmela? I don't think she does.
Interesting.
I think she's just kind of like rolling her eyes at like, oh, like those mob guys, they've always got Gumars. Like, I think she was kind of like her expression, that's how it always has. Well, actually, it hasn't always read like that to me. Mm-hmm. But on this viewing, that's what I was kind of seeing. And then Carmela was interpreting her interpretation.
Completely possible.
As she was thinking that.
Well, especially because when they were in Paris, we
saw how differently they
Rosalie
interpret things.
Developed as a character who doesn't really read beneath the surface and is content to kind of take things on a basic level.
Exactly.
But I just think it's such an interesting idea for the show to explore because so much TV and so much movie is presented on such a basic level of just the narrative, and this show is so focused and obsessed with what lies beneath that level. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to see it's so meta, but then to have this movie where it is so basic, but then there
so
are
many
these levels underneath. Even a basic...
Like I said, it's an amazing movie. It's
Right.
the deepest movie you've ever seen.
It kind of seems it.
Because, yeah, it's just like, it's even more levels than The Soprano.
Right. Yeah, there's...
Because it's like one of the levels of The Sopranos.
Even actually, when Silvio is in New York at the restaurant, we have him, saying kind of like, he's being told his heart goes out, and then Silvio saying, just say it then, Walt fucking Whitman over here, right?
Yeah.
So like, again, like these metaphors and these ideas of reading beneath the surface, saying something but meaning something else is really being explored in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's so many. Just after that, the scene, Carmine's dream, right? And we've been exploring dreams throughout the entire series. But there's actually so much going on there, like what is in the box, this kind of surreal environment. But also this idea that Carmine acknowledging of his wife making him cry, which was interesting to me because that also kind of tied me to Phil Leotardo and Johnny Sack, who are also characters who cry. And we explicitly kind of deal with that in this episode. Johnny Sack, when he cries, being seen as a sign of weakness. Phil Leotardo crying when Tony is manipulating him, at least according to our interpretation or a possible interpretation. But now we actually have, interestingly, little Carmine crying and acknowledging it and actually admitting to it and taking it almost as a sign of strength. Yeah. So there is this dream that he has.
And like a positive character trait.
Yeah, and there's this dream he has where it's almost like his Costa Mesa. It's almost like this void, like this beyond.
Did we know about his dream before, or we just know this part that he was... Like,
Carmine?
Yeah.
I don't think we know what it's.
Yeah, I didn't think so either. Just like even the way he says that, he's like, it's like in my dream. It's like like he was saying it like other people had heard about it before. Yeah. Like I said, I want to talk about him,
but there is this this aspect of him being confronted by something supernatural, like Phil Leotardo was, like Tony was, and actually taking a different course.
Yeah, it's about happiness.
Maybe it will change.
Yeah.
But there is this leadership vacuum, and Carmine is choosing to step away, which is different than how any characters have really ever dealt with these issues in the past. Of course.
Well, interestingly, like Phil Leotardo kind of was dealing with it that way. He was like, stepping back, trying to focus on his family, talking about how he never really wanted that. He won't get in the way. He should have made different choices. But then during his revelations in he should have made different choices, he changes his mind. I think.
Right.
It's not said. It's not said outright. But he was also kind of like we actually get insight into what it means to these guys to be boss and how that impacts their lives making that choice. Right. We don't really have that level of empathy for Tony necessarily because we've kind of like started off with him always being boss basically. But when you see these characters who are kind of confronted with the possibility of making that choice, it's really interesting to see how they choose it.
I mean,
we don't really see Tony choose it.
He chooses it in his own way.
Yeah, but not like this. Not being like, "Hey, do you want to be boss?" And they're like, "Nah."
Right.
And it shows you kind of again like what that would look like to them, like that they acknowledge how much this would impact their lives.
Right.
And maybe that's not the way they want their lives to be impacted.
Interesting.
Like maybe they don't want that.
Right. And then ultimately with Phil Leotardo, he actually makes a decision that is impacted by Johnny Sack dying, who it seems was kind of holding him back on avenging his brother. But it's interesting because...
I mean, kind of. There's more more than that.
Even that last scene, that ties into Cleaver for me. There is this kind of like overly dramatic... this invitation to violence, also the christening, kind of this nod to the Godfather,
and that music coming in,
But there's definitely, for me, like I can't not separate that scene from the baptism scene in the Godfather.
No, I know.
And and for me, just like that allusion and this strong reference to mafia movies and mafia film.
Oh yeah,
is like there's this specter of violence hanging over that last scene, which is interesting because it applies to both Phil Leotardo and it also applies to Christopher and Tony having this awkward embrace. Does that suggest violence in that future?
Right.
Which is an interesting thought.
Yeah. Well, it certainly seems so.
Right.
But we also don't.
We don't know. We don't know. Never seen this.
You know what? I would actually kind of want, maybe like in 20 years, like to do
when
this
we watch
show,
the show
one
the
day.
next time.
Yes. And give spoilers.
Okay. We'll do
because you know what?
round two.
Sometimes it holds me back.
Okay.
That's all I have to say about that.
Okay.
Like, sometimes I wish I could talk about how things connect forward.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I'm sorry.
It's okay. We made that choice.
Right. It's true. We don't want to ruin it for you. For the like one person who's listening to this podcast while watching the show for the first time.
Someone did tell us that they were watching it for the first time.
Yeah, actually maybe even more than one.
Yeah.
That's nice.
So that's very lovely.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
But actually that last scene is interesting because it does tie into, for me, film and also maybe this like more basic aspect of mafia movies and kind of archetypes of mafia characters, and that there will be more violence, and it almost plays into this base interpretation of those films or this base kind of experience of watching these films where it is very kind of sensationalistic and immediate, and there aren't as many levels, because it seems like it's gearing up for the end of the series to be more violent, to be more explosive, to be more dramatic. The music is more dramatic. We'll see. Because we can't give any spoilers.
Will we go to the mattresses this season?
But then there's also this idea of Leotardo thinking, that's my fucking legacy, that I didn't challenge Tony over Tony Blundetto.
Yes, and he brings it back to when his family came to the United States, and like he's like, his family's always been taking shit from people.
Right, and there's this idea of control, which is something that Johnny Sack is also dealing with in his last days, taking the cigarettes, and that's something we can talk about separately. But it's really interesting. I think they leave it in a really interesting place, and it's kind of a perfect summary of the themes that have been happening in this episode. It's pretty incredibly done.
No, it's I mean, it's so cinematic, and we realized after we were talking about last episode, we often forget to talk about our references to the Godfather movies.
Oh right,
we often
in Sopranos home movies, I forgot to make my reference to Godfather 2.
I know, but it's just like
and Fredo dying, that I've been wanting to make for a really long time, but that's fine. I missed it.
He missed his chance. But like the references are so strong, and I think that's also that kind of, like you were saying, this meta level of like kind of gearing us up, like, I don't know, not tricking us, but like making us remember how it feels to watch that kind of movie and like to see where your expectations go, right? And then this show usually goes against people's expectations too. But it's interesting to like experience that as a viewer, to like monitor what they can elicit from you, like what they can kind of like gear you up for. Like you feel like an adrenaline rush, right? Like you kind of like when in that last scene when that music comes on, you're like, oh shit, like what is going to happen right now? It
actually kind of, the last time in this show that I can remember having an experience like that is almost like the end of season 1, where they're building up tension towards the end of the season. So it's something that they've kind of gotten away from.
Whew. It is so intense.
Yeah.
But I mean, this like, it's stupid how good this show is. Like, it's just
That's
so
why we can't
dumb.
do 2 a week anymore. It's too much.
It's just so stupid. Like, we get characters in this episode, for example, Warren Feldman.
Warren Feldman.
I feel like we're jumping all over the place, but I just like, I'm excited.
We have a line. We have our segues.
We got our segues, yeah. Warren Feldman, like, we never see, spoiler, we never see this character again. Right?
Spoiler. We said no spoilers.
I know, but like,
it's okay.
It's okay.
That's an okay spoiler.
That's an okay spoiler. This episode it stands on its own very much too. But like the characters that we all of a sudden get an insight into in this episode that we hadn't before, or we meet them for the first time and get this insight into them, is a lot. It's really, really deep.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you feel like the purpose of having a Warren Feldman is in this episode?
I think it does tie into kind of the interpretation thing, right? Because of like the doctor interpret, like his, Johnny Sack's doctor's interpretation of his case versus this Dr. Feldman, Warren Feldman's interpretation of the case. But then, like, what gets them there is really interesting, right? So then, like, the information that we find out about Warren's history, kind of how he ends up treating, like, the kind of person he is. It's such a deep character exploration. Like, we find out a lot about him that kind of goes beyond that. Like, you asked, like, what's the purpose of having that character? Like, I think there is a purpose for that interpretation bit, but
Right.
we also delve a lot deeper into just like the psyche of different kinds of people. And I think, again, kind of like we had with Livia, kind of like we had with, who's the guy who was talking about Schrodinger's cat we were talking about?
Oh, the Schrodinger's cat guy.
Well, we
I
should
forget
know his name.
He's a famous actor, but I'm
Kind of
slipping
like
right
that scene. Like, this is kind of, again, presenting us with one of these alternatives.
Schwinn.
Schwinn. Yeah.
Schwinn.
It's presenting us with this like very strong alternative viewpoint to the viewpoints that we get really used to seeing in this show.
Right.
And
for me, actually, there's something sensationalistic about Warren Feldman. Like when he's talking about this Torchiano story
Right.
to Johnny Sack, who actually knew this guy. There's something about like he has this draw to the mob. It's almost
right,
similar
like
to
he's like, I know who you are. He totally has a
he
draw
knows
towards that.
who he is.
Yeah.
And it's almost similar to Kupferberg watching the Matthew Weiner as a mob specialist on TV earlier. They're kind of living vicariously through these people.
Yeah.
There's this interest, and they're kind of drawn to it, probably for the same reasons that were examined in the Cleaver movie. Like there is this kind of
power
and also this kind of sensationalism that exists that's immediately appealing to these people. So I actually kind of question why. I guess Warren Feldman's intentions, I guess, are rather clear, but I guess it's rather obvious what part of his intentions are. It's just to kind of be close to that world.
Yeah.
Whereas obviously it's not like we've had a deeper examination of that world throughout this series. It's nothing to really be that compelling. The examination of the mob world in The Sopranos isn't sensationalistic. It's not exciting. It's really actually quite bleak. It's quite depressing. If anything, the philosophy is quite nihilistic.
Yeah.
And yet these people are still drawn to these characters.
Yeah. No, it's really like I had a note that I wanted to talk about with that, and I can't find it at the moment. Maybe I'll get to it later.
That's what happens when we just watch the show and then come talk. So that's what happens with this format.
Yeah. Shoot. But anyways, you're correct.
We'll get
you're
there.
correct. It'll come to me.
No, I do think that it's an interesting character, and I think that interpretation, that medical interpretation, is interesting in how it plays into interpretations.
Well, he also like that thing that he talks about, like who looks like a hero, right? Like what he's talking about, like why doctors would give that shorter prognosis, and then if someone lives longer, they look like a hero.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty deep to the show too, because it really does like examine everyone's motivations, right? Like we've talked a lot about how people really want to examine the motivations of these mob guys, right? Like we're like, oh, like why do they want to kill? But this show teaches us to look at like Carmela and her motivations, and to look at Father Phil and his motivations, right? Like this was what this show really does, is like almost like trains us to, shrink people in some ways too, right? Like it really calls on you to do that.
Right.
And so I think like Warren Feldman for me is one of those interesting characters like that, where we really like are forced to think about him and how he became who he is and what his role is now in this moment in Johnny Sack's life.
Right.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to watch this show. You're filling in a lot of blanks.
Right.
All the time.
Yeah.
And like it's interesting, like probably if you, and again, like we run into this all the time, like even I was just talking about like Rosalie's expression, like there's probably a lot of things that you and I interpret differently, even though we talk about our interpretations a lot, and we sometimes like bring those up,
right?
But because you're filling in a lot of blanks,
right,
for yourself.
Absolutely. And definitely the interpretations out there across the board are different on this show, and
Definitely.
I think that's kind of the point.
That's the point
too.
Again,
I think it
doesn't make
more
a
and
difference.
more what kind of becomes apparent by the end of the show is like that's not the point of all of this. The point is not to kind of pigeonhole things as this or that, black or white, this means this. Even though we do that a lot, it's part of a kind of greater purpose of that aspect of interpretation, which is being examined in this episode specifically. And everybody's opinions are equally valid, and everything has the potential to be interesting. And even if David Chase had intentions in making something, it almost doesn't matter, because the ability for it to bring out different interpretations is, for me, almost more powerful.
Like, that's what the art is.
Right.
And I think that's what this show is. Again, that's like what Cleaver is.
That's what Cleaver is.
The best movie ever.
Chris is really amazing as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted to
He's like
come back to that. He is. He really is. Okay.
Okay. How about...
What else do we want to talk about?
I want to talk about this...
to read through my notes.
Johnny Sack kind of confronting death.
Right. And
this idea of there is no
thing.
stage 5. Yeah. Having him in stage 4 cancer.
And that's clearly, it's the title of the episode. We always like to pay attention to those things.
One should always pay attention to the titles of the episode.
Like,
but that is...
I don't know why we're telling you this,
that is nothing.
Right.
Stage 5 doesn't exist. And then the episode is actually titled Stage 5. So we're actually occupying the space that doesn't exist. Which is what the show's doing all the time. It's this big nothing, and it's posing these questions of what does matter. When one reflects on their life, what is one's legacy? What matters? What does one value? And characters are also dealing with this at different points in their life, but obviously one is confronted with it
right before they die.
Right before death. It is really interesting because for Johnny Sack, it seems like this idea of Johnny wanted to die as he lived in total control is very important. And him smoking the cigarettes is actually really fascinating because, going back to symbols, cigarettes are something that we've been talking about going all the way back to season 1. Cigarettes versus cigars. Often cigars being smoked at times where people do feel in control or possibly wanting to project a feeling of being in control.
And we used to see Johnny Sack smoke cigars.
Right. And we do see, and cigarettes are often... being smoked at times of characters being out of control. Yeah. So in this moment, it's interesting that Johnny chooses cigarettes as his method of being in control. We also see cigarettes being used at different times, even in this episode, like JT goes to cigarettes when Christopher comes over. There is this question of control. Like characters, it's almost like a tell for them being in or out of control, but like characters wanting to do something where they can control their life.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a pretty strong symbol, and it's very relevant to Johnny Sack's last days and what he can do. What are these kind of like limited means that he has to feel powerful or to feel in control? Because in the end of his life, after all of his decisions, he really is left with almost nothing. Except he does have a family, and we can kind of see how
who love him.
His true love for his family and his true caring for them does actually mean something. Because they are there for them, even when everything else has been taken away.
Yeah.
And I think that is valuable, and that is something that the show presents that is worth thinking about.
Oh, yeah.
As one of the only valid things in life that is actually worth valuing.
Yeah. I mean, not to get, like, too dark, but, like, this depiction of someone dying is... I mean, I've never, like, been with someone in their last moments as they die.
Right.
But that's where this episode takes us, right? They like take us into this guy who, has made tons of different choices in his life. And we started late, late season 5 and season 6 to understand his love for his family and what kind of choices he makes because of that.
Right.
But, we really see it here. His impact on people and his impact on his family.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And anyways, it's just a really like powerful portrayal of death and these types of questions people ask.
Absolutely. And that question of love and respect is actually, I think, something that passes on to Tony. It's something that he's worrying about because he's remembering his relationship with Dickie when he's with Melfi, and he talks about wanting to pass on this respect and love and feeling like that hasn't
But he couldn't
happened.
do that with Chris.
Right. So where did he fail there?
Yeah.
Like, what did Tony not do? What did Tony
or
not
what
have?
about him is not capable of doing that?
Right.
Right? Like, what's inside him that makes him not able to love and, bolster this person like Dickie did for him?
Right. And I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it's very relevant to who Tony Soprano is. Because Johnny Sack seems to have something there that maybe Tony doesn't. In fact, Tony's relationship even with his family is very complicated. Like, what is the love and respect that Tony commands from Carmela, Meadow, and AJ independently?
Yeah.
It's a very complicated relationship. Does he love them? He does, but how kind of unconditional, how deep is that love? What does it really mean? Like, how much does he care about himself before them?
I don't know, like, you know, if it's like fair. I mean, they're fictional characters. I don't have
They
to be
don't
unfair
exist.
to them. But like, I don't know if it's fair to Tony to say like that, like the way that he loves his family is like better or worse. Like different people love people differently,
Right.
too, right? And so
Right.
like, I don't know, like I think like, and we saw it when Tony was in the hospital last season. Like we saw Meadow and Carmela there with him. We know how great the impact on them would be if / when Tony dies.
Right.
And AJ too, kind of. I mean, we know that would impact him. He wouldn't be there by the bedside, but like Tony's death would greatly impact AJ.
Right.
You know, and AJ's life. So I don't know that it's like love that's different, but I think it is kind of this, like the nature of the relationship and what that actually, like how functional it actually is, or
Right.
I don't know, authentic or real.
Yeah.
I don't know, something. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but there's like a deeper thing than just like, does Tony love his family?
No, of course. And I think that's too simplistic, and clearly he does.
Totally. Yeah.
Right, but there are like different kinds of love, and there are different priorities in life. Actually, I don't think that Tony has the same priority for family as Johnny Sack does.
No, I would agree with you.
And
did Johnny Sack have Gumars?
They say that he didn't.
Right.
I think. Yeah.
Right.
And we never see that.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So it's very interesting. We have so I mean, for me, there's also one other thing before I do want to talk more about these like levels of interpretation, but there is one other thing, which is just like Johnny Sack being told by the person escorting him that it was the right move,
right,
and to quit smoking. That was the right move. And the question is, was that the right move for him? And that in comparison to him bumming a smoke shortly after while he's on oxygen.
Well, it is that kind, and we have that brought up a lot in this episode, like, what's the point? Right? If it's all going to end this way anyways, then what's the point?
Which is valid.
Yeah.
And what is right for Johnny Sack at that point? I mean, was it right for him to quit? The person escorting him could state that. And I guess from a kind
And Ginny's clearly mad about it because, you know, he couldn't even, she lost 27 pounds.
Right.
And he couldn't even quit smoking.
But it's so interesting that in the end, it's this idea of Feldman saying it's when people are confronted with death, there's this kind of scramble to maintain control.
Yeah.
And it's interesting actually, like going back and viewing the show after finishing it, because like that aspect of control is being examined even from the very beginning. And you can kind of get these things that are discussed outright in the end of the series.
Even with characters who aren't near to death, it's this constant grasp for control, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Or characters, or I guess maybe you could say like characters who know they're at any moment going to die.
Right.
Which I think, and that's what I think we grapple with in this episode with like, you know, the examination of the different possible New York bosses.
Right.
Right? Like that's something they're aware of too.
Right. Absolutely.
Right? That like they're going to live a life where it's very likely that they're going to die at any moment.
Right. Totally. Yeah.
Or that's always a possibility. You always have to be watching your back.
Right.
You always have to be, you know, thinking about these political moves and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And how you're perceived and the power that you command.
And what does it mean to strive for that as your primary goal?
Well, yeah.
In life? Or to hold on to that?
I don't know. I think this episode, like, it really gives me insight into, and again, like I was saying before, like, we don't often think about Tony before he was a boss. We get only a little bit of insight into that. But, like, again, this choice that people make to become boss, you really get an insight into what that
I think we do. Actually, that's one thing I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of time before he becomes boss, much more so than almost any other mob recreation, because typically the boss is the boss. We actually have all this time. I mean, all of season 1 and then season 2, we have Tony kind of acting in the shadows, but
I just never like what I'm talking about is like that choice. Like we never see him really like choosing it necessarily.
Right.
And I think that's the thing
But
that indicates how he's different from these other guys.
Right. It's
And-
very Machiavellian.
Yeah.
I mean, he's definitely manipulating. He's definitely kind of pulling strings, and he kind of ends up in that position of power
Yes.
as a result. But that's kind of his strategy.
Exactly.
But he is
Exactly.
less violent than Phil Leotardo.
Yes.
He wouldn't choose to do that in the same way.
Yes.
He wouldn't choose to kind of get...
No, we
to-
see like Tony's leadership style.
Right.
Basically, right? Like we see how he gets the things he wants to get.
Right.
It's not the way the other guys do.
Right. It's interesting.
You know, like he is more manipulative and yeah,
Right.
like that's his style.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's really it's incredibly done.
Right. Yeah. No.
What we learn about characters in this episode. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, actually, there was a scene in relation to that where he's talking to Phil Leotardo and he says, "We're lucky fucks, I tell myself every day." And Phil Leotardo just shrugs, which is interesting because that manipulation kind of worked for Phil Leotardo when he was in the hospital bed. But it seems to me that it's kind
worn
of
off
faded
a little bit. Yeah.
at this point. The Phil Leotardo just doesn't care. Like he's also had the same relationship to his close to death experience of where it's kind of faded.
Yep.
He's returned to the kind
Yep.
of quotidian.
Yep.
He's returned to everyday life.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and the connection between, I guess, like I would say, like the three characters, like Phil, Tony, and Johnny Sack, right? Because we do see them, like they are kind of the same generation. I mean, who knows how old Phil Leotardo is? It's always a question. But
Billy would have been
Billy,
47.
yeah.
He's older.
I guess so. I guess Phil's older. Yeah. Anyways, but like they're talking about like the three of them who have all had these run-ins, like near-death experiences, right? Like Phil. Well, I guess like actually Polly says it too. Polly's like I cancer, like I fought my cancer, like and John wasn't able to or whatever. Like he says that thing when they're giving the toast.
It's a very
forget how he
tact
says
thing
it.
to say.
But like we see these characters who have like come face to face with death and then come back.
Right.
Right? Like or like, you know, had this opportunity to do something different. Johnny Sack's the first one of that kind of group of characters that we see actually die.
Right.
And he doesn't have this chance to like learn from this near death
Interesting.
experience that he's having.
Yeah.
Right? Like he's just dead.
Right.
And we see like, you know, we see what happened to him when he was told that maybe he had longer to live.
Right.
Right? Like he kind of started making slightly different choices.
Right.
Right? But then once it was clear that that was actually like, you know, too optimistic or
Right.
then he went right back to smoking and then and dying, right? He didn't have a chance to kind of enact what Tony and Phil like both have had chances to do, right? Like Phil could have stayed in Florida. Phil was putting off being boss up till now.
Right.
You know, he wasn't looking to take control because of, you know, his heart and his family.
Well, and interestingly too, with Johnny Sack, like maybe his choices actually do impact his amount of life left. Like when Feldman gives him this prognosis, like maybe the fact that he did choose to revert to smoking actually impacted when he died. Like maybe he actually could have lived for longer.
Right.
But there is a reaction to his actions.
You don't know.
Yeah. I was interested too for Tony as a character who we're talking about as somebody who manipulates this kind of Machiavellian, this Machiavellian person, how JT kind of trying to manipulate him falls flat when Christopher tells him that he needs to let Tony know that he was the writer. There is something that just doesn't work. Like we're told earlier in the episode, Syl says, "Oh, Christopher doesn't come to the Bing anymore," and it's these small things that make it very apparent that something is wrong. With JT telling Tony that he's just dropping by to look for Chris and then starts talking about Cleaver.
Yes.
There is kind of something there. Also, Tony immediately recognizing that there's a bump on his head. These things that Tony is also very adept at recognizing the bullshit in others.
Yes.
That kind of plays into his leadership style.
Even, like, interestingly, like, even when Agent Harris comes at the beginning of the episode, right?
Right.
And he kind of, like, mistakenly reveals that information about Christopher, like them having also talked to Christopher.
Right.
Like, nothing's not on purpose
for
these kind of manipulative characters, right?
Totally.
So like they don't, like every word they choose is
Perhaps he didn't tell you that.
yeah.
And they know. I mean, they know of the dynamics between Tony
Yeah.
and Christopher and what's going on
Yeah.
there. It is interesting. And I think there's that aspect, too, of Tony saying to Melfi, I've been coming here for years now. I know too much about the subconscious now. Like,
Yeah.
deep down, he can kind of recognize these things in others. And even if he can't recognize it in himself,
Yeah.
he can recognize it in the people around him.
Definitely. Oh, definitely. Yeah, he does. He has a good bullshit detector.
Yep.
And I mean, and he also is strongly in tune with his subconscious, right? Like, we know he's made decisions, like way back to killing Pussy, based on his dream,
Right.
right? Like, he puts a lot of
He's very intuitive.
yeah, no, definitely. And I think you have to be intuitive to be a good manipulator.
To be a good mob boss.
Well, I don't know about to be a good. I don't know to be a good mob boss. I don't know, but
I don't know any mob bosses.
Me
for real.
neither.
I don't think. Maybe I do.
What do your parents do again?
They're not mob bosses.
Oh, man. Yeah, I don't know. It's like, it's just too good. It's just too good. I can't even. I'm looking through my notes and I'm just thinking about what I want to talk about. There's so much there. Also, like, you know, like, for example, like Christopher going to that meeting with, I guess, someone from AA or NA, right? Who's that actor?
Christopher McDonald?
Yes, exactly.
Tappy Timmons.
Tappy Timmons.
I'm not old enough to recognize him from all the stuff he was in the 80s.
Yeah.
70s, I guess. I don't know. 80s, I guess. I don't know. I think of him as Tappy Timmons.
Yeah, no, I got that. But, like, is Christopher clean?
Great question. There is actually
He's drinking.
Yeah, right. He's not doing great, it seems. He seems out of control. That aspect of control
Yes.
seems to be popping up for him.
Yes. Well, we know that 3 months ago something happened, right? Like, we get this again. So maybe this. I mean,
what
maybe
is this?
3 months has passed
Right.
before this episode, because we have Chris calling Tony for his birthday.
I mean, Cleaver is
in
done.
last episode.
That takes time.
Yeah. So there is a jump in this episode.
Yeah, apparently production is boring. So that
Production
takes
is boring.
time.
But yeah, we were
They're
kind of
already
like we
bored
had,
of it.
it's been a while since we had seen where Cleaver was at too. Like, we hadn't checked in with them since that episode with Ben Kingsley, basically. You know,
Right. Things have really come.
things
They've
have
really
come a
been
long way.
completed.
But yeah, is he clean? Like, what's happening with them? This baby's been born,
Right.
right? He's put out this movie. He's not going to the Bing anymore.
Right.
Tony's reading into his psyche pretty well too. Like, Tony knows that something. I mean, he knows that something's up with Christopher.
Right.
He had to be kind of coached into his interpretation of the film to, like, you know, see Christopher in this way. But it does. I mean, it does kind of go back to what I was saying, like him relying on dreams and him kind of being intuitive, relying on his instincts. Like, he's picking up on these. He's picking up on these things because the idea has kind of been put into his head, right? So
Right.
he starts to see things the way that he's, like, been trained to see them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Those are most of my
Yeah,
thoughts on
okay.
this episode. So I'm interested if you have any other ones.
I'm gonna look through
Missed
my
notes.
stuff.
I can
Yeah.
talk about how as Val looks through her notes,
Yeah,
we're very excitingly speaking through 2 microphones right now for the first time. Great timing.
Maybe it'll sound like crap. We didn't really do a good test.
Maybe it'll sound like crap. I built a microphone, so now we have 2. I'm not really a recording person. I'm more just play music. So this is a new experiment, but it's great timing as we almost complete the show. So that's very exciting for us. And maybe it sounds better. Who knows?
I don't know. We'll see when we listen to it.
We'll see.
Um,
Val has now looked through her notes.
yeah, well, hopefully. No, I took a lot of notes this episode, actually. I think I covered everything that I mean, there was a lot. I did not cover everything that I wrote down, but I'm just trying to see if there's anything else that really showed up. Oh, the other thing, just because we were just talking about Christopher, the other thing that I wrote down was that when he's in that meeting, he's talking about how he's trying to steer clear of old associates on purpose, right? In order to stay clean.
Interesting.
And,
So
like,
does
really,
that relate to not going to the Bing?
well, I think so, right? And we really see it. I mean, we've seen it before, but we, like, really understand, like, those guys don't give a fuck about Chris's sobriety.
Right.
Right? None of them do. We've seen Tony pretend to and then do things like pressure Chris into drinking or whatever, right? Like, those guys don't give a fuck about him. And he's acknowledged that.
Yeah.
At this point.
The only drinks that are ordered at the Bing are a soda water by Tony and a Diet Coke by JT. So maybe it's fine. Maybe he should go.
Yeah, they're not drinking either.
Maybe it would be fine.
Interesting. I do like that. Sorry, now I'm just like seeing my notes. I do love one of the scenes with Johnny Sack. I forget which one it is, but when Ginny's talking about saying like miracles do happen, and he says not in this family, right? And she's kind of talking about this like positive, like having a positive outlook, like will make you live longer, right? And it's kind of, we were talking about it a little bit before, but I like when he was like, so with like 6-year-olds dying of leukemia, like is that because of negative thinking?
Right. That seems to put her off her line of positive thinking.
But I mean, that's just like something that I get mad at in real life, is kind of like the triteness that people sometimes use, like talking around these things.
Right. You're
like
more of a Johnny than a Ginny Sack, you're saying?
I'm definitely more of a Johnny than a Ginny Sack, I would
that's
say.
True. I agree.
But yeah, I think it just like that hit on something pretty important for me, just in terms of like how we deal with death and how different people like the coping strategies different people need to use and the stories people need to tell themselves in order to kind of come to terms with it, like for themselves personally or for a family member or for a New York mob boss or whatever.
Or for a New York mob boss.
Yeah, typical.
Just the standard things.
The standard things
to worry about.
But yeah, I hope this sounds good on our 2 microphones. I was listening.
Mm-hmm.
I was feeling sad before we started recording this episode because
we're watching Sopranos and you get depressed.
Because we're watching Sopranos.
I do too. Everyone gets depressed. Everyone's depressed.
Are you guys depressed yet? Let us know. Yeah. This is one of those episodes.
We're almost there.
Yeah.
We've almost done it.
No, I was also getting really sad because we are almost done.
We are almost done.
And I was saying like I don't know when the next time we'll watch The Sopranos would be.
It's really sad.
I don't know. So anyways, I hope you guys are enjoying it.
Hope you're enjoying it.
And write us an email.
We've heard from some of our favorite writers on The Sopranos in the last week, which makes us very happy. We're really nerdy about it. Yeah,
but
great.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool.
About Sopranos.
Yeah, it's really, really cool, and we really like when you guys get in touch with us.
Yeah.
Because it's really fun to talk about.
Yeah.
So.
Unfortunately, I can't go to Sopranos Con, which I didn't know about until our friends told us about it, but I will be
our
on.
Friends.
Our friend. I don't know if we're friends yet, but...
Yeah, well, we're just 2 people who are doing this in our apartment, so I don't know about Sopranos Con for either
I would
of
have
us.
gone. I probably would have gone. I'd be down.
Well,
we're close.
I'm good with just emails from people. I don't think anyone really wants to meet us, but
that's true. It's not about them meeting us.
Yeah.
It's about us meeting them.
Yeah, it's true.
Right. Yeah.
It's true. But if you ever are in New York and you want to have a beer and talk about Sopranos,
that's what we like to do.
Have beer and Sopranos.
2 things we like.
So, anyways.
Thanks for listening.
Yep.
And we'll be back. We're really getting near the end. Crazy.
Next week. 1 a week.
Okay. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.